For over 100 years, a tiny little Class 3 railroad kept plugging away in northern West Virginia. This railroad was principally a mover of coal, and that industry was so profitable that it was able to stay afloat pretty much just doing that. But when the industry died, so did this railroad. Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains a fossil fuel. Please do not ban my use. And today, we are going to discuss the West Virginia Northern Railroad, or WVN, which is a relatively obscure line that stuck around for way longer than you'd think. The earliest days of this railroad actually date back to a narrow gauge line, originally under the Kingwood and Tunnelton Railway Company that was formed in 1884. The local promoters wanted it to serve local coal mines and interchange with the Baltimore and Ohio main line at Tunnelton, which was just 11 miles away. This was actually a pretty good idea. The coal industry was ramping up, and West Virginia has just so much coal, you guys. You have no idea. I've gone on record to say I was raised there, so I have a pretty good understanding where the state's economy was for pretty much the entirety of its existence, and the reason why the economy's in the tank right now. It's the coal. So having a rail line that could transport coal to a larger one is still a profitable venture. Even though they likely would never have become as large as B&O, B&O would still depend on them. And worst case scenario, they might get bought by B&O and make a ton of money off of it. They completed their grading by 1885, but they had financing issues, and the company went into bankruptcy. Though the original line was completed by a receiver on January 7th, 1888. Then it was sold on May 5th of that year to another group of investors that included C.M. Bishop, William G. Brown, W.M.O. Dawson, and George W. Whittison, who then organized it into the Tunnelton, Kingwood, and Fairchance Railroad. Judging by the name, you might guess that they actually wanted to extend the line to Fairchance, Pennsylvania, and then push west towards Morgantown under a new system formed in 1889 that was called the Morgantown and Kingwood Railroad, or M&K. But they once again wound up in financial trouble, and they were forced to sell in January of 1895 for $30,000 to another group led by George C. Sturgis and J. Ammi Martin. They then renamed the property as the West Virginia Northern Railroad, and actually wound up converting it from narrow gauge to standard gauge by December of 1895. These new investors were much more well-funded, and they did want to expand. They did carry out the standard gauge extension to Morgantown via Rollsburg and Deckers Creek in 1907. They actually later sold that part, though, to B&O as an inside gateway between their Baltimore-Grafton main line and their Sheepskin line. But the original short part of the WVN would remain and do exceedingly well despite being extremely small. They were focused on the coal industry as that was the big ticket item for that area, and the coal needed to be moved. They served multiple mines over their time and even began passenger service in the area too. They served 11 stops and had a small staging yard with B&O to transfer the coal traffic in Tunnelton. As for their rolling stock, mostly what they used during the steam age were consolidations, 280s. Their 8 driving wheels made them perfect for heavy coal trains, and the line continued operations well in the background. While all the Class 1s made notable moves during the 1910s, the 20s, the 30s, WVN just hung out, did its thing, and continued to move coal. They did eventually dieselize, and purchased mostly EMD switchers, like NW2s and SW1200s. While at face value a railroad using switchers on their main line seems weird, it's impossible for me to overstate just how small WVN was. it wasn't a long line, and EMD switchers had plenty of power to do the job. They didn't need anything larger than them, and that's what they kept using, all the way up until 1991. However, their traffic was always reliant on coal. Because of the small area, passenger service was never particularly profitable, if at all. It was mostly a service just to help out the local community more than anything. And they really only had the coal to move, and nothing else. And over time, coal has gotten used less and less and less. And then a recession hit the country in the 1980s. And that hit what remained of the coal industry incredibly hard. WVN's traffic almost completely dried up. And they were so small that it was pretty much impossible for them to diversify. And in the case of a Class 1, the railroad is generally large enough to look to other areas that they occupy for other goods to move. But WVN did not have this privilege. As a Class 3, they were small. Never super profitable, but profitable enough to be fine. Until their only traffic source was gone. Without the coal, they had nothing, as did many of the local communities. And in 1991, they shut down operations entirely. But that wasn't the end of their story. 3 years later, in 1994, a group of railroad enthusiasts from the area actually wanted to see the lines preserved. The rails were still there at the time, and they called themselves Kingwood Northern Incorporated. They reopened the operation as a tourist line, a novel idea that had seen success in other areas of the country. They utilized the EMD diesels that were on the property, number 50 and number 52. From the outside looking in, it actually did alright for a while. It became more and more popular. Despite not having a steam locomotive, which usually is the big ticket seller for a heritage line, the ride was still nice. West Virginia is a beautiful state, and that particular area was lovely, so people flocked just to enjoy the ride. It didn't matter what locomotive was pulling it. But the group was only keeping up appearances, however. In the background, things weren't so good. They had mounting debts, as well as a legal battle with the city of Kingwood that would make it so that the company owed $1 million. Something that they just could not afford, and sustain operations. Kingwood Northern Incorporated was then forced to shut down, leaving the line again unused, and it would remain that way. The organization, in order to pay off its debt, wound up selling the remaining equipment on the property and tore up the rails for scrap. In 2002, scrappers removed the last of the trackage. And today, in its place, is a rail trail, known as the West Virginia Northern Rail Trail, where the line once ran. There have been whispers of a possible resurgence of the line, but nothing's ever come of that, as funding has never been secured. And I think it's very unlikely we'll ever see trains run along that area again. But in one small bright spot in this otherwise pretty sad story, 2 of the railroad's consolidation steam locomotives, number 8 and number 9, had actually been saved after they were discovered just chillin' in the woods of Pennsylvania. Both wound up being purchased by the West Virginia Railroad Museum, though I admit I'm having a lot of trouble confirming the exact status of those locomotives as of now, but I did find a pretty recent picture of number 8, so I assume they're still around. There's also number 19, which is apparently at the West Virginia Central Railroad, who, as of recent pictures, at least has a nice warm tarp over her boiler. So that's nice. Either way though, West Virginia Northern is now nothing but a memory to the few people that still remember it. But hopefully now, more of you know that once it existed. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, SomeDude267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitchens 131-232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Roro Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Lord Hoff 444, That Guy with the Beard, Mark Holding, Murder Drone Stall, A Person 723, DM Trouble Typhoon, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Isofer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Ohio Trucker 1, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Alderic Jaspers, Tom Redlion, NS Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, Dr. Racer78, and the Baxter. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.